Hi everyone. So just before we begin, Ruth, Dan and I just wanted to quickly introduce ourselves. We are the team who will be organising Big Question for this next year. My name is Meg. I'm a second year at Josephine Butler College studying archaeology, and I'm so excited for Big Question this term. We have two great speakers, Gavin Walker and Becca Oliver, who will be talking to us about the hope that we can have during this time. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say, what the Bible has to say, and being able to discuss with you guys.
Hi, so I'm Ruth. I'm a second year mathematician from Stevenson College. I'm currently in Salisbury, so yeah, not that close from Durham, missing Durham a lot. But yeah, it's so exciting that we can do Big Question from all around the country and the world. Yeah, I'd say what I'm most excited about with Big Question this next year is just the chance to delve deeper into big questions, big life topics. Yeah, for myself and alongside people who are going to come at these questions from all sorts of different point of views. And yeah, just see what the Bible has to say about them, and how the Bible speaks into every aspect of our day-to-day lives. And yeah, just discover together.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm one of the people helping organise Big Question over the next year. Like a lot of you, I'm currently sat home. Home for me is a town called Whaley Bridge in the Peak District, which you've probably never heard of. When I'm in Durham, I'm a second year maths student from Trevs. I'm excited about Big Question because I believe in the great hope that Jesus brings for my life and for my future, and I want other people to be able to hear about it so that they can accept the invitation that God is holding out for them as well.
Welcome to Big Question. Slightly different format to normal. Normally we would be a lunch bar on Friday lunchtimes, but obviously due to the circumstances things are a bit different. But we're so glad we could still put on this event, and we're so grateful for the technology we have to be able to do this. Big Question is all about making a space for people to have deep, honest conversations about life, faith and God. Whatever you do or don't believe, we just want to invite you to come and question your beliefs and question our beliefs. Yeah, just think things through. Today's question is going to be Christ and the coronavirus. How can we trust God in difficult times? We see so much suffering in the world around us at the moment, particularly with the coronavirus. And it can be easy to think, where is God in all of this? Or how is God allowing this to happen? Can he truly be good or powerful or wise? And yet we see the coronavirus running rampant. And we're going to be listening to a talk from Gavin Walker. So it'll be a roughly 20-minute talk on this question. And then Gavin will answer some commonly asked kind of pre-prepared questions, things you might be thinking in response to his talk. So he'll be giving some answers to those. But if you have other questions you'd like to ask him, do post on the event page or in the comments, and hopefully he'll be able to get back to you on them. Yeah, so I think that's it from me. Let's dive straight into the talk.
Good afternoon. It's great to be asked to speak at this big question. Great if you're watching. I'm sorry that we can't do this in person. My name's Gavin Walker. I'm the minister of Bishopdown Evangelical Church in Salisbury. Normally when I'm asked where's Salisbury, I used to have to say it's near Stonehenge. Most people have heard of Stonehenge, have a vague idea of where that is, but now I kind of imagine Vladimir Putin's office with a map of the world, and there's a pin sticking in Salisbury after the Novichok poisoning a couple of years ago. Thankfully, things have returned to normal since then, until a few weeks ago when the lockdown started. Now we're all isolating, some more than others. In our new terminology, because of health conditions, my family and I are shielding. We're getting our shopping delivered via internet shops. A friend is collecting prescriptions and anything else we need. And the only time we've been out in the last 5 weeks was a family trip to the GP first thing in the morning for blood tests. And we watched the news. and we see the graph of infections and hospitalizations and deaths increase day by day. And we wonder, what will happen if COVID-19 gets rooted into countries without a healthcare system like ours? But we aren't the first generation to face something like this. In 1918, the Spanish flu killed about, it's estimated, 25 to 50 million people, with an estimated third of the world's population being infected with the virus. The Black Death, bubonic plague of the 14th century is thought to have killed a quarter to a third of the world's population at the time. We don't know yet how severe this current pandemic will be, but it has caused suffering and grief, and I suspect anger, to many already. And I'm conscious that indeed it may have caused suffering and grief to some who are listening. So how can Christians say that we can trust God in times like this? How can a good, all-powerful God allow such misery on the scale that we are seeing? This is one of the most asked questions of Christians. How can a good, all-powerful God allow suffering? C.S. Lewis wrote a little book called The Problem of Pain. This is my copy of it. And he introduces it by explaining why, a few years before he wrote it, he didn't believe in God. He speaks of the vastness of the universe, largely filled with a black, cold emptiness. Then on our planet there is life, but that life suffers pain, and mankind have both consciousness of their pain and reason, and then quoting him, whereby he is enabled to foresee his own pain, which henceforth is preceded with acute mental suffering, and to foresee his own death, while keenly desiring permanence. He continues describing the pain that mankind inflict on each other, the pain that civilizations inflict, and the destiny of the universe as, again quoting him, a uniform infinity of homogeneous matter at a low temperature. All stories will come to nothing. All life will turn out in the end to have been a transitory and senseless contortion upon the idiotic face of infinite matter. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. His point is that the world with its suffering, he would have said, was an argument against the existence of God. C.S. Lewis became a Christian, but it wasn't the question of suffering and evil that convinced him of the truth of Christianity. And I suspect I won't be able to do that through this talk either. But I hope that it will challenge you to think about where you do put your trust, where you do put your hope, and perhaps to go further in examining the Christian faith. So the question is, if there is a good, all-powerful God, how can the world be like it is? How can a world with COVID-19 exist with such a God? Later on in his book, C.S. Lewis gives the classic argument for this. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. Put it another way, a good and all-powerful God would be able to create a world with no suffering and evil. There is suffering and evil. Therefore, God is either not good, not all-powerful, or not there. How can Christians answer this? How can Christians trust God in the face of suffering? I want to try and outline an answer, but it will only be an outline given time constraints, and I want to also acknowledge that Christians don't have all the answers. There is mystery. After doing that, I want to secondly pose a question for you if your view is that there is no God. If you just cannot reconcile the world as it is with an all-powerful good God. And then finally, I'll conclude with one more reason why I believe we can trust God in the face of suffering. So firstly, some thoughts on how to answer the question. And we need to start by going back to Genesis 3 in the Bible and what Christians call the fall of mankind. It was the sin of Adam and Eve, as they mistrusted and so rebelled against God, that introduced sin into the world. From that point on, the world has been broken, fractured, groaning because of humanity's sin. Every single one of us, if we honestly examine our own hearts, we know that we can't even live up to our own standards, let alone God's. We all mistrust God and we rebel against him. And that leads to two types of suffering in this world. What you could call moral evil, where people commit sins against each other, and what has been called natural evil, illness, ecological disasters, earthquakes, and so on. And there is overlap between the two, but there is a distinction. But both, at root, are caused by humanity's sin. But does that mean that God isn't all-powerful? He can be good, but he isn't powerful enough to create a perfect world. Some have argued this, saying that God either isn't all-powerful or that he limits his power in order to give people free will. And they've used that free will to sin, and that causes the evil and suffering that we see. That would be very convenient for the purposes of answering the question of evil. But the Bible's very clear that God does not constrain his power in this way. Instead, the Bible is clear that God is all-powerful, knowing all there is to know, working all things in line with his sovereign will. And for sure there is mystery here. But the Bible is also clear that people have responsibility for the actions they take and the thoughts they think. And we must face the consequences of those actions and thoughts. And so there is sin, and therefore evil and suffering. So perhaps God isn't good. He wants there to be sin and evil and suffering. There is another option. And that is to say that God brings good out of or through evil and suffering. And I think that is the answer that the Bible gives. One of the most well-known examples from the Bible which illustrates both God's sovereignty and human responsibility, and God bringing good out of evil, is Joseph in the Old Testament. This is not Jesus' father, it's Joseph from the Old Testament. And he was sold into slavery by his brothers. And when he was reunited with them, and they were worried about how he would deal with them, he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Another example I can give comes from my own life. And as I explain it, I need to say that what we might think of as good may well not overlap perfectly with what God says is good. We might think of what is good for us, is what makes us happy, comfortable, joyous, when actually a greater good for us would be to know God, which will bring joy for eternity. We'll come back to the problem of defining good in a minute. When I was younger, I was pretty unwell and in hospital, and there was one night when the consultant was called in as I was getting a lot worse, and thankfully I recovered, but it's a permanent illness. I still have that illness today, hence being house and garden mad at the moment. But God used that time to get me asking questions about life. What is it all about? And in the end, through that, I became a Christian. God used my suffering for good, and I wouldn't want to go back and change what happened. Now, most of the time, we just won't be able to see the links. It won't be clear how God can use suffering for good, because we're not God. One picture of this is that we can see the world like the underside of a tapestry with all the threads looking like a random mess. But God sees the perfect tapestry from above. So there is suffering and evil in this world because of humanity's sin. Yet God is all-powerful and good, and in some way that we don't know, good comes from the evil and suffering that we see. That is the Christian position. But if you are going through suffering at the moment, if you are grieving for someone, you probably don't want to hear this. You'll be crying out, why? Why is it happening? Why did it happen? What possible good can come from it? And I won't be able to answer that question, why? But the witness of people in the Bible is that they did suffer, but they had reason to continue trusting God. And so do I. As do millions of Christians around the world, many of whom face intense suffering. You may not agree. You may not think that God just... You may think that God just isn't there. But if so, I want to ask you to think about one thing. And if you are suffering, if you are grieving at the moment, and I was with you, I wouldn't say this. Now wouldn't be the time to argue or discuss. It would be a time to give comfort. But in a talk like this, it's right to ask a question of you. And that question is, what is good and what is bad? Is COVID-19 a bad thing? And I hope that almost all, if not all of us, would say, yes, of course, stupid, of course it's a bad thing. Aren't you watching the news? But whether something is good or bad is a moral question. They are moral categories. And if there is no God, I would want to ask you what basis you have for your moral categories. In an atheistic, macroevolutionary world, COVID-19 is attacking older people and people with underlying health conditions like me. And so in evolutionary terms, COVID-19 is actually quite good for humanity moving forward. It's getting rid of the physically weaker parts rather than the stronger gene pool. Except as I say that, I've fallen back into a moral category of good in a way that has no basis in such a worldview. This is a quote from Richard Dawkins. He said that in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. No evil, no good. So no morality. No raging at COVID-19, because the universe is simply pitilessly indifferent. But I've never met anyone who lives like that. Who lives with no morality. Who lives with no grieving at death. So the question is, where do the categories of good and evil come from? If there isn't something or someone transcendent who has made the world in such a way that there is a good and evil built into the creation and into us. Before you throw away the thought of a good and all-powerful God, it's worth thinking about what that actually means. What you would be losing. Finally, if there is a good, all-powerful God, you would expect him to do something about suffering and evil, wouldn't you? Well, Christians believe that he has, and he will. The eternal Son of God took on human nature and came into this world. He lived a morally good life, sinless, innocent of evil. and he was put to death on a cross. In Acts chapter 2, in the Bible, Peter is speaking to a crowd of Jews in Jerusalem a few weeks after the death of Jesus on the cross. And Peter said to them, "This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross." Men tried and convicted and killed Jesus. But it was God's plan. And God raised him from death on the third day. Now, many things flow from the cross. Jesus' death leaves us with a warning. And perhaps COVID-19 should warn us about this too. We are all going to die at some point or other. Our days on this earth are limited. And are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for our judgment by God? When Jesus was taught about some people who'd been killed, one group by Pilate, one group by a falling tower, his response was, "Do you think these were worse sinners than you? No, but unless you repent, you too will all perish." Jesus saw those deaths as being a warning to others. Get ready for when you too will die. Turn to God for forgiveness through Jesus before it's too late. And so the second thing that comes from the cross is that through Jesus Christ, we can be forgiven for our sin and be prepared for our death and what follows. We can have the hope of the new creation where there will be no evil or suffering. This is one reason why Christians can be filled with hope even in the face of suffering and death. Because we can trust God to bring us into his presence with joy because Jesus died for us. But Jesus' death also gives us comfort now. When Jesus was at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, he wept. He was angry and he wept at death and suffering. And then Jesus himself died. He knows what it is to suffer. He knows what we go through when we are grieving or when we are suffering. The Apostle Paul, who knew incredible suffering, specifically because he lived as a Christian, he wrote that through Christ our comfort overflows. And each of us can know that comfort when we come to put our trust in the Lord Jesus. Christ's death leads to a warning, but hope and comfort. The question I was asked to talk about was, can we trust God in difficult times? This is what a friend has written in a short book. It's called Beyond the Big Sea. He's been living with incurable cancer for 4 to 5 years. And he writes this: "I have no choice but to suffer with my cancer. But Jesus had a choice. He could have opted out. And he was tempted to do that just before his death, but he chose to stay and fight his fear and go to his death. Why? For love of the lost and suffering human beings." This means not only that Jesus suffered something far worse than anything I could ever go through, but that this suffering on the cross is the miracle cure. Not for cancer, but for something far worse, being separated from God for eternity. A friend trusts God through difficult times. And I think Christians can trust a good, all-powerful God in the face of evil and suffering, because Jesus suffered and died on the cross for us. Well, I've been asked to deal with a few questions, and if you have been watching and you have a question, feel free to post it on the chat, and I'll try and get back to you, or someone else will get back to you about that. But questions that have come up related to what we've been thinking about. And the first one is a person's suffering linked to their sin? Is a person's suffering linked to their sin? And I think the answer is yes. And no, and perhaps. So let me try and explain. Clearly there is some suffering that is caused by a person's own sin. A person who drinks too much alcohol and ends up with liver failure has contributed to their suffering by their drinking. Punching a wall in anger, resulting in a broken hand, is similar. If you punch a wall and because you're angry and you break your hand, your suffering is a result of punching the wall, of what you've done. But on other occasions, someone's pain won't be caused by their own sin. Being hit by a drunk driver, for instance, having a genetic illness. And if you read the book of Job in the Bible, you'll see that Job's suffering isn't caused by his own sin, despite what his comforters think and say. And sometimes it won't be clear if someone's sin has led to what they are going through. With some illnesses, lifestyle can be a contributing factor, but not always. There are cases where we just won't know whether someone's sin, the way they've lived, has led to their suffering. So at root, while there isn't a one-to-one connection of every case of suffering with that person's sin, what we can say is that all suffering is caused by sin. Starting with the sin of Adam and Eve, every person from then on rebels against God's good ways. And so death and suffering are part of this world. So when you face suffering, it may not be caused by specific sins in your life. It probably isn't. But what will you do with that suffering? Quoting C.S. Lewis again, who I quoted earlier, he wrote, "Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." What will you do with your suffering? It is a pointer to the fact that this world is broken. It's beautiful, but it's broken. It does point to the fact that there is sin in this world. A second question. Why do natural disasters happen? How can they be caused by human sin? Well, the first thing to say is that human sin can make natural disasters worse than they would have been. Poor building practices leading to greater damage in the event of an earthquake, as we've seen in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Poverty leading to people living in known danger zones because they can't afford to live anywhere else. So human sin can contribute to the magnitude of suffering when natural disasters happen. But secondly, natural disasters, Christians would argue, as with all other suffering, stem from sin. In Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, they were rightly judged. But the creation also suffered as part of that judgment. No longer would they be living in an idyllic garden in God's presence. Now they would be living apart from God, in a world that would fight back against humanity. These are the words spoken to Adam, and listen for what it means for the world. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." The ground, this world, is cursed because of human sin, and it fights back against humanity's attempt to subdue it. And so this is what Paul, the Apostle Paul, writes in the New Testament in Romans chapter 8. He says, "For the creation, this world, waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God." Christians believe that there will come a day when God will judge all sin, when there will be justice, And on that day, a new creation will be brought into being that isn't cursed, but is glorious. So the current world groans for that day, Paul says in the next verse. And that is the hope that Christians have as well. Okay, a third question. Why did Jesus have to suffer if he had no sin? Why did Jesus have to suffer if he had no sin? Well, I've been arguing that there is a connection between suffering and sin. Our rebellion against God is the root cause of all evil and suffering in the world. So if there were a perfect human being who didn't sin, who didn't rebel against God, that person presumably wouldn't suffer. By the way, there is a possibly apocryphal story about G.K. Chesterton, who answered a question posed by the Times newspaper. They were asking, what is wrong with the world, just over 100 years ago? And G.K. Chesterton wrote a letter back saying, "Dear Sir, I am yours, G.K. Chesterton." His point being that there is no one who is sinless or perfect, so we all contribute to what is wrong with the world. Except the Bible points us to the one man who did live in perfect obedience to God the Father, Jesus Christ, as G.K. Chesterton also believed. But if Jesus was sinless, why did he suffer and die on the cross? Was it a terrible miscarriage of justice that God just got wrong? Well, it was a terrible miscarriage of justice. If you read the gospel accounts of the trial leading up to Jesus' death, you can see that even the human judge Pilate thinks that he's innocent. But God used the cross for good, for immense good. The Old Testament kind of sets up a dilemma for God. He is just, and so all sin must be punished by the curse of death. But he is merciful, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance, as Peter puts it in one of his letters. So when Jesus dies on the cross, that problem is solved. He bears the sins of all those who trust him, so that those who trust him can be declared innocent of their sin. God shows his mercy at the cross. But Jesus takes the curse of death, God's anger at sin, so that those who trust him are freed from that curse. They have the hope of life beyond death. We see God's justice at the cross as well. And this is why Christians are so keen to tell other people about Jesus, because he offers forgiveness and hope and life and joy in God. And this is why the early Christians, some of whom had seen Jesus after he had risen from the dead, why they were willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus, many being put to death. They were convinced that through Jesus they would enter eternal life. They would enter the new creation in God's presence, where there will be no suffering or evil. And that is the invitation held out to everyone. If you want to think about the Christian faith some more, do get in touch with The Big Question, and someone will get back to you. Or get in touch with a Christian that you know. Uncover Mark is a great way of finding out more about Jesus as you read Mark's Gospel along with someone else and you discuss it as you go along. Post something on the chat of this Big Question site, and someone will get back to you if you want to find out more. And I or someone else will post a list of further resources on the chat if you want to specifically think about the question of an all-powerful good God and how he can relate to suffering and evil. If you want to think about that some more, there'll be some resources listed on the chat here. But thank you for listening, and God bless.
Well, that concludes our first Big Question online. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it helpful and interesting, and useful to think through at this time. Please do join us again next week, same time. We'll be having our second part of this little Christ in Coronavirus series. So we'll be looking at whether life after lockdown is worth the wait, or whether there's something greater we can put our hope in, something more than returning to normal life to look forward to. We hope you can make that, and thank you for listening.